So let's get started. We have a lot to get through. Today we're going to get through all the way through Augustine, and we're going to get all the way up to 529, which was the Second Council of Orange. Not the First Council of Orange, the Second Council of Orange. So, last week we talked about Pelagianism. I gave an introduction to the Pelagian controversy, to Augustine's life, and then we ended by outlining the three main tenets of Pelagianism. And let me just go over them again. Pelagius and his followers, Celestius and Rufinus the Syrian, taught three main things. The first thing they taught was that original sin did not exist. So there's no mystical connection between Adam and humanity. The result of Adam's sin was that human nature was not injured, no harm was done to human nature, and therefore people are not totally depraved or totally unable. But on the contrary, they are able to obey the commandments of God. Secondly, Pelagius argued that human free will after the fall is completely free to choose between good and evil. And this is important because I called this libertarian free will. This is the doctrine of free will that Pelagius endorsed. Pelagius says that the human will is like a scale, and that scale is perfectly balanced on either side. So that in any moral, spiritual decision that you make, you are perfectly free to choose between good and evil. You do not have any prior disposition. A baby is born as a blank slate and thus is an independent moral agent. So you go into an ice cream shop and you have no preference. You may choose anything. Chocolate, vanilla, ice cream, you have no preference. You can choose whatever you want. You're an independent moral actor. You can choose the sin ice cream or the righteousness ice cream. And thirdly, Pelagius redefined grace. So this is the weirdest of all, especially for us Reformed folk. For Pelagius, grace isn't a power outside of us that helps us to obey God. For Pelagius, grace is nature. Another way to put that is that for Pelagius, grace is a creational category rather than a redemptive category. For Pelagius, the fact that God created us with a will that allowed us to obey Him, that very fact is God's grace. And also he says that grace is the law, or any external teaching that God does to us to help us obey Him. And of course the presupposition there is that there's no original sin, that we're not depraved, that we're not totally unable. So that was Pelagius. And today I want to go through Augustine's thought. Augustine is radically different from Pelagius in every way. Remember, we said that Pelagius had a moral theology or a pastoral theology. That's how you could describe his theology in broad strokes. Pelagius was concerned to address people where they were today. And Pelagius was concerned with moral obedience. Now, Augustine wasn't unconcerned with those things, but in broad strokes, his theology starts from the perspective of God rather than the perspective of man. You could say that Augustine's theology is a top-down theology rather than a bottom-up theology. And Augustine disagreed vehemently with every one of the central tenets of Pelagianism. And so, let's talk a little bit about Augustine's anthropology.
Colby?
Yes.
I'm curious, do you have any sense of how influential Pelagius' theology was in the church?
I think it was pretty... The debate that Pelagius was a part of was definitely controversial in this period. I don't have any sense in terms of numbers. Like, I don't know that I could say, oh, he had like a 30% following in the church or something like that. But he was definitely influential. I told you last week that Rufinus and Pelagius and Celestius, they were all active in Rome. They were well known. Augustine heard of Pelagius pretty early. And so I think they did have a following. And besides that, there were people who were raising these questions. In other letters that Augustine writes, he writes to people who were asking him questions from debates that arose in like monasteries or other religious groups. There were debates that arose, and they would ask Augustine for his opinion. So yeah, I think I would see that it was fairly influential. So Augustine's anthropology. Augustine held to original sin. For Augustine, the sin when Adam ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was crucial. And everything followed from that decision. Because when Adam sinned, all of us sinned in him. And the whole mass of humanity, the whole human race, fell into sin. Here's what he says in Nature and Grace. Human nature was in the beginning created blameless and without any defect. But that human nature, in which each of us is born of Adam, now needs a physician because it is not in good health. All the goods which it has in its constitution, life, the senses, and the mind, it has from the sovereign God, its creator and maker. But the defect which darkens and weakens those natural goods so that there is need for enlightenment and healing did not come from its blameless maker. It came from original sin, which was committed by free choice. For this reason, our guilty nature is liable to a just penalty. So Augustine was very clear on this. After the fall, for Augustine, humanity is described as a mass of perdition. That's a phrase that he likes to use, a mass of perdition, or a lump of perdition. So that we're all in the same sinful boat. We all share in the same sinful nature, and therefore all who are descended of Adam partake in this sinful nature. And Augustine argues this point from Romans 5. And the key was Romans 5:14, where Paul says, "Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam." That's important. Even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam. Well, what does that mean? Even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam. For Augustine, what that meant was even people who, unlike Adam, had not committed a specific sin, death still reigned over them. And so, because of that, there had to be some principle, some effect of Adam's fall that caused death still to reign over those, even those who had not sinned in the likeness of the transgression of Adam. And he makes much of that in the punishment and the forgiveness of sins. So for Augustine, humanity after the fall was a mess. It was broken, it was destitute, it was hopeless. All it could do was rebel against its creator and hate and do evil. That's number one. Augustine held to original sin. Number two, Augustine held that the free will after the fall was a slave to sin. Augustine held that the free will after the fall was a slave to sin. Now, this is important. Augustine did not deny free will. He was very careful here. He didn't say, we don't have free will. In fact, he wrote a whole book to correct those who were saying we didn't have a free will. It's called Grace and Free Choice. And here's what he said. And he wrote this a little bit later in life as he was looking back on that book. And he said, I wrote the book entitled Grace and Free Choice on account of those who suppose that free choice is denied when the grace of God is defended, and therefore defend free choice so that they deny the grace of God, claiming that it is given in accord with our merits. So you see, Augustine did not deny the freedom of the will. In fact, he said that God's commandments presuppose human freedom. In other words, the commands of God wouldn't even make sense if we really had free will. So Augustine was not a fatalist. There's a spectrum here. There's a spectrum of the freedom of the will and the grace of God. And over on one side, you have pure Pelagianism, where we don't need the grace of God at all. And human free will is completely and utterly free to do as it pleases, with no predisposition, no inclination, no weight at all. On the other side, you have not Calvinism, which a lot of people mistakenly think. You have fatalism. Fatalism says that we are so bound to our nature and to God's predetermination that even if those who are predestined to condemnation, even if they wanted to be saved, they still couldn't. And that's not what Augustine thinks at all. Augustine has a very, I found, sophisticated view of these issues. What Augustine denied wasn't free will, it was libertarian free will. After the fall, human nature and the human will was taken captive to sin and needed healing by God's grace. So, Augustine talked about two different wills. I'll give them to you in Latin first to show how smart I am, and then I'll give them to you in English.
You better pronounce them right.
Well, I haven't been trained in Latin pronunciation, so it'll probably be wrong. I'm not sure about those V's. So Augustine talked about the liberum arbitrium captivatum and the liberum arbitrium liberatum. And translated, that means the free will captive and the free will free. So you either have free will captive or you have free will free. Those are your options. And it goes back to the illustration of the weighted scale. For Augustine, as I mentioned already in contrast with Pelagianism, for Augustine, the human will can be pictured like a scale, only one side of the scale is weighted towards sin. And so humans still have free will, but our free will is held captive to sin. It's like, again, the illustration of the ice cream shop. When you go into an ice cream shop, and there's this, I don't know what store this is, but they only sell 3 flavors of ice cream. They sell chocolate, they sell vanilla, and they sell strawberry. And you go in there and you love chocolate, but you hate vanilla and strawberry. For Augustine, that's what the free will is like. And so when you go into that store, you always order the chocolate because you love chocolate and you hate strawberry and vanilla. And you do that freely. You choose the chocolate. It's a choice that you make. But the reason that it's free is because it is in accord with your own desires. Not that you're some kind of independent moral agent and that you therefore have no desire and that you're making the decision essentially at random. So that's the key. Yeah, Sergio.
Would you say that Jonathan Edwards talks about later about the freedom of the will? In the sense that we choose freely based on what our affections are, and so if you have an affection for sin, you're choosing freely what that affection is.
Right, that's exactly what I was just going to say. And I haven't read Edwards much, but okay, all right, well, but that sounds right. The key for Augustine is that the will is governed by desire, but man doesn't determine his own spiritual desires. That's the whole key for Augustine. Listen to this. This is from a letter that he wrote to a friend called To Simplician. Who has it in his power to have such a motive present to his mind that his will shall be influenced to believe? Who can welcome in his mind something which does not give him delight? But who has it in his power to ensure that something that will delight him will turn up? Or that he will take delight in what turns up? If those things delight us, which serve our advancement toward God, that is due not to our own whim or industry or meritorious works, but to the inspiration of God and to the grace which He bestows. Now, Augustine says it a little bit more simply in another book called Grace and Free Choice. He says, we always have a free will, but it is not always good. For it is either free from righteousness when it is enslaved to sin, and then it is evil, or it is free from sin when it is enslaved to righteousness, and then it is good. So we always have free will for Augustine. The question is, what are your desires? What do you love? You will freely choose whatever you love. If it's sex, if it's power, if it's money, then that's what you'll freely choose for Augustine. And if by the grace of God it's Jesus, then you'll freely choose Him as well. And this is called, in modern Reformed parlance, total what?
Inability.
Total inability. Very good. Wow. 10 points to Sergio. I was hoping that somebody would say total depravity, and then I would have to correct that person.
I want it to be different.
Yeah, it's called total inability. That's an important part of Reformed doctrine. And total inability means that a person cannot change his own nature by the exercise of his own volition. So, you have that verse, can the leopard change his spots, right? Once your desires are fixed, you do not determine what you desire. Okay, so I'll skip that. Okay, so for Augustine, post-lapsarian man is not able to obey God's commands by his natural ability, and certainly unable to merit his or initiate his own salvation. Now, here and there I'm going to be dropping clues and hints to things that are going to be more important later. So let me just drop this right here. One other thing that is characteristic of Augustine's view of man is this. Augustine, from the beginning, was heavily influenced by Platonism. And I think all throughout his life, although I think it gets a little bit better, all throughout his life he maintains a certain view of what constitutes human nature that is known as a dichotomous anthropology. It's the official word for it. But basically what it means is that for Augustine, there is a tension between the body and the soul. And you can see this if you read his Confessions or other works. But for Augustine, the soul is what tends toward God, and the body is what gets dragged down by the things of the earth. And I just want to mention this. I'll recall it later. This is going to be important in understanding Martin Luther's anthropology. So that's Augustine's Doctrine of Man. Are there any questions about that before I move on? It's really important to understand that idea of the ice cream shop or the balanced scales, because that gives, I think, you a very nuanced picture and a very accurate picture of what Augustine thinks. And it's a really good way to think about it. Yeah, Paul?
Could you give a difference between fatalism and Calvinism?
Yeah. So, fatalism would say, I'll go back to the ice cream metaphor, or the ice cream illustration. Fatalism would say that you have been predestined by God to choose the chocolate, and so even if you wanted to choose the vanilla, you couldn't choose it. In other words, fatalism really says that God, when He predestines us, He predestines the end without predestining the means or the desire. So that we're just totally chosen at random and there's nothing we can do about it. Does that make sense? Okay. And we'll look at that a little bit later. In fact, just a few minutes. All right. Any other questions? Okay. So let's move on to Augustine's soteriology, Augustine's doctrine of salvation. First, I want you to notice Augustine's definition of grace. This is much more in accord with what we would say. Remember the Pelagian definition of grace, which was so foreign to our experience and belief as Calvinists. For Pelagius, grace is nature. For Pelagius, there's no supernatural help that comes to man. For Pelagius, it's important to say that we, on our own power, have the ability to obey God. For Augustine, it's just the opposite. For Augustine, we have no power to obey God. For Augustine, we're utterly helpless before God and before His commandments. And therefore, for Augustine, grace is God's generous and unmerited attention to humanity by which human nature is restored and renewed. It's something that's outside of us. We're here and God is up there, and God is sending His grace and His power to help us believe. That's the idea of the Augustinian conception of grace. And Augustine held a very strong doctrine of grace. For Augustine, we are totally dependent upon God for our salvation from the beginning to the end of our lives. Augustine's doctrine of grace can be characterized by the idea of prevenient grace. Prevenient. It sounds like a mashup of two words that's not quite spelled right. But prevenient grace is the idea that there is this grace of God that comes before. It's the before grace. All human response to God is preceded and enabled by grace for Augustine. Whatever spiritual good humans do, God's grace always precedes it and enables it. That's the big picture rule of Augustine's doctrine of grace. Man is not capable of doing any spiritual good apart from God's grace. Whatever it is, if he takes the smallest step, if he has the tiniest grain of faith, if he does the most minuscule good work, if he has any inclination whatsoever to love God, trust God, seek truth, pursue happiness in Jesus, it's always, always, always due to the prior reception of God's grace. We might call it monergism. From the beginning to the end, it's all about God and what He does. And He gets the glory. If Bob does something, even this much, that contributes to his own salvation, apart from the help of God's grace, Bob gets the glory, not God. And for Augustine, it's very important that God gets the glory for everything good that he does or that happens in his life. Everything in the Christian life is the result of God's grace, including predestination, conversion, good works, and perseverance to the end. So let's take a look. I want to take a look at one passage. There's so many passages that we could take a look at from Augustine. But I want to point out this passage on predestination in particular. This is from a book called The Gift of Perseverance. And I want you to pay attention and notice some different things that Augustine holds regarding predestination. So I'm going to read this paragraph. This predestination of the saints is nothing other than the foreknowledge and preparation of the benefits of God, by which He most certainly sets free whoever are set free. But where are the rest left by the most just judgment of God, save in the mass of perdition? In that term, mass of perdition. In the mass, God left Tyre and Sidon, who could also have believed if they had seen those miraculous signs of Christ. But because it was not given to them that they should believe, there was also denied to them the means by which they might believe. From this we see that some people naturally have in their native ability a divine gift of intelligence by which they may be moved to the faith if they hear words or see signs which are suited to their minds. And yet, if by the more profound judgment of God they are not set apart from the mass of perdition by the predestination of grace, they are not presented with those divine words or deeds by which they could have believed if they heard or saw such things. Okay, that I think is important, and one that I chose specifically for a number of reasons. I want you to notice a few things here. First of all, this is single predestination. There is single predestination, and then there's what Luther and Calvin held, which was double predestination. Calvin said that God not only predestined the elect, but He also predestined the damned to condemnation. For Augustine, after the fall, there's this big, massive perdition that everybody is a part of. And predestination is when God takes out those people from the mass of perdition and sets them on a course to salvation. Secondly, and this is really important, because this, Paul, is the difference between fatalism and, I think, a right view of predestination. Augustine says that God ordains the means as well as the ends. Very important. Augustine says that God, when He predestines you, He doesn't predestine you apart from predestining the means. So, if an unbeliever comes to this church and hears Jeff's preaching and decides he wants to give his life to Christ, that decision not only was predestined, but the whole course of events that led him to that decision was predestined. Jeff's sermon, his coming to this church, the friend that invited him, whatever happened that led him to the point of saying, I want to follow Jesus, God predestined all of that. And that's the big difference between fatalism and what Augustine holds. And then the other thing that I want you to notice is that for Augustine, grace is irresistible. If God predestines you, you cannot say no. If God chooses you and draws you to Himself, you're totally and irrevocably and inexorably drawn to Him. It's set in stone. But, lest we misunderstand, it has means. God predestines the means, so that we don't come kicking and screaming. We come according to our own free will. And then conversion, good works, perseverance, all these things are things that God predestined, or that God does, that God initiates and brings to completion. So, one more thing about Augustine's doctrine of salvation, and this is another nugget that I'm going to lay down for next week. Justification. For Augustine, justification and sanctification are not distinguished. Okay? Augustine doesn't have any concept of imputed righteousness. For Augustine, justification is defined as to make righteous rather than to declare righteous. So for Augustine, there's no difference between justification and sanctification. When you get saved, for Augustine, that's the beginning of your sanctification. But there's no declaration. There's no imputation of Christ's righteousness to you. And that's, frankly, that's Luther's big idea that he develops. And we'll talk about that when we get to Luther. So are there any questions about Augustine's soteriology, his view of salvation? Because I tried to do the best I could. There's only so much, I only have so much time, so there's only so much I could say about it. But the big thing to remember is that it is, for Augustine, this is God's doing from beginning to end. Yeah?
If justification is to make righteous, what sanctification definition?
Well, according to Augustine or according to us? According to us, justification is an act of God where He pardons our sins and counts us as righteous because He imputes Christ's righteousness to us. And then sanctification is where He actually makes us to be righteous. So the way you could think of it is, in sanctification, He makes us into the kind of person that He declares us to be in justification. And that's what the whole Christian life is about. And that's only comes to an end at glorification, when our sanctification is perfected. So it's a difference between what kind of person you are, that's sanctification, and what your status is before God, and that's justification. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
Is this why you remember you said that the Catholics would own Augustine,
Right.
as well as the Protestants?
Right.
This is maybe one of the reasons, because there's not real clarity on this.
Well, yeah. This is to this day, the Catholics don't distinguish. I'm not totally up on my modern day Catholic theology, but I believe that they don't distinguish between justification and sanctification, at least in the same way that we do. So for Augustine, the salvation starts when you're baptized, and grace is conveyed to you through the medium of the water, and that starts your justification. And it's not sufficient, but at the same time you can't be saved without it. And that's a big deal in Augustine's life. That's a big deal in the Pelagian writings. And so, yeah, Augustine doesn't think you can be saved unless you're baptized. Yeah.
So, going back to God predestining the means, so you would say that for Augustine, a truly free will then would be a will that loves the Lord, and that for him, when God calls us out of sin, we freely choose to have faith in him because our will has been set free from sin.
Right.
As opposed to how the Reformed faith, the way they make irresistible grace, the way sometimes it's taught, it can be like, you're a Christian, now goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
Into the cave you go.
Well, I think there's a profound... the way that the Westminster Confession of Faith talks about, or the catechisms especially, talk about effectual calling, I think that's essentially in accord with what Augustine is saying about grace. The idea in the Westminster catechisms is that when we're effectually called or regenerated, that what God is doing is He's persuading us and enabling us to embrace Jesus Christ. So that conversion is so God makes Jesus so beautiful and so wonderful to us, and that we freely go to Him. We're irresistibly attracted to Him. And so I think that, I don't know, some people may teach that differently, but at least that's what I see in the confession and the catechisms. All right.
I think the distinction is people interpret irresistible grace to mean I still don't want to be a Christian.
Right.
I don't have any choice in the matter.
Yeah, and that's the fatalistic interpretation, and that's easy to do.
The word implies that. Irresistible implies that there is some resistance being put up, and that's the reason it's really not a good word to use there at all, because there is the implication that someone is resisting, but the resistance is insufficient.
Futile.
Right.
That's what Edwards makes a big deal of, is that every time you say irresistible or can't or unable, there's always the implication that there is an effort being made, and if you say no, if the effort isn't there, then it's in fact free as choosing chocolate ice cream, because you're not trying to resist that.
Right.
So the irresistible part, I think, it makes the acronym come out right, but
yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah. Well, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that word. I mean, I think that's the popular misconception, but I don't think there's any reason why the word irresistible, has to have those connotations. I think we can still use that word and understand it to mean we're inexorably drawn to Jesus by the persuasion of the Holy Spirit. Yeah.
I was always meshed with Romans 1, where, like in 19 and 20, and it talks about how that God has plainly showed Himself, and people from the beginning of time have retained a knowledge of God, but chose to ignore it. as opposed, I mean, some of this almost sounds like, this grace stuff almost sounds like it, I don't know how to say it. It sounds like this predestination stuff. I mean, it's like people clearly have known about God from the beginning of time, and yet.
Right.
So how does that fit in with the two different? Is that too big of a question?
Oh, I mean, I think to answer it briefly, I think Augustine would say, yeah, Romans 1 is the essence of sin. That people exchange the worship of God for the worship of, idols, birds, reptiles, and they didn't give the glory that was due to God to Him. And Augustine would say that that's because their desires were evil. And as we find out in Romans 5, that they're born in Adam. So, yeah, I think that's what Augustine would say. Oh man, I don't know if I have enough time here. What I really wanted to do was show you Augustine's conversion in his own words. If you really want to see an example of beautiful grace at work in the life of a Christian, read the Confessions. Just read it anyway, whether you want to see that or not. But if you don't have time to read the whole book, read Book 8 of the Confessions. All Augustine's life, he was held in bondage to worldly pleasure and ambitions, but especially lust. He loved sex. He took a mistress when he was 19, and he lived with her for around 15 years. But I guess I'll do this anyway, now that I've already started. In the summer of 386, he had a famous conversion experience, and I summarized it last time, but I want to go into a little more detail this time, because the way that he described his own life and his own conversion is so compelling, and Augustine's words just jump off the page as though he was speaking to us today. One day in the summer of 386, Augustine visited a man named Simplicianus. And Simplicianus was a bishop who had influenced Augustine's other spiritual mentor, Ambrose. And Simplicianus told Augustine two stories about two saints, a man named Victorinus and an Egyptian monk named Antony. And both of these men were men that could have had almost anything. But they both gave up everything and renounced all worldly honors and pleasures to follow God. And these stories, when Simplicianus told Augustine these stories, they convicted him. They convicted him about his own reluctance to finally renounce the world. Listen to what he says here. And again, this is Confessions, Book 8. He says, many years of my life had passed, 12 unless I am wrong, since I had read Cicero's Hortensius. Remember I talked about that last week. At the age of 19, and it had inspired me to study philosophy. But I still postponed my renunciation of the world's joys, which would have left me free to look for that other happiness, the very search for which, let alone its discovery, I ought to have prized above the discovery of all human treasures and kingdoms, or the ability to enjoy all the pleasures of the body at a mere nod of the head. As a youth, I had been woefully at fault, particularly in adolescence. I had prayed to you for chastity and said, "Give me chastity and continence, but not yet." For I was afraid that you would answer my prayer at once and cure me too soon of the disease of lust, which I wanted satisfied, not quelled. So Augustine struggled greatly to give up the love of the world and the love of its pleasures. Here's what he says. I was quite sure that it was better for me to give myself up to your love than to surrender to my own lust. But while I wanted to follow the first course and was convinced that it was right, I was still a slave to the pleasures of the second. Finally, here's what happened. I was asking these questions, weeping all the while. Augustine hits his face and just contorts his body and goes through all of these groanings and gnashings and revolts on the precipice of his conversion. I was asking these questions, weeping all the while, with the most bitter sorrow in my heart, when all at once I heard the sing-song voice of a child in a nearby house. Whether it was the voice of a boy or girl, I cannot say. But again and again it repeated the refrain, "Take it and read. Take it and read." So I hurried back to the place where Alypius was sitting, that's his friend. For when I stood up to move away, I had put down the book containing Paul's epistles. I seized it and opened it, and in silence I read the first passage on which my eyes fell. Not in reveling and drunkenness, not in lust and wantonness, not in quarrels and rivalries. Rather, arm yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ. Spend no more thought on nature and nature's appetites. It's from Romans 13 through 14. I had no wish to read more and no need to do so. For in an instant, as I came to the end of the sentence, it was as though the light of confidence flooded into my heart and all the darkness of doubt was dispelled. After all those years of being captive to lust, of being captive to sin, Augustine was finally able to put it all away, to renounce it, and to fully commit to following Jesus Christ. And then I'll close with this. Augustine, in the next book, had a profound reflection on his pagan life in relation to his free will. This is what he says. But during all those years, that is, all the years that he was a pagan, where was my free will? What was the hidden, secret place from which it was summoned in a moment, so that I might bend my neck to your easy yoke and take your light burden on my shoulders, Christ Jesus, my helper and my Redeemer? How sweet all at once it was for me to be rid of those fruitless joys which I had once feared to lose and was now glad to reject. You drove them from me, you who are the true, the sovereign joy. You drove them from me and took their place, you who are sweeter than all pleasure, though not to flesh and blood. You who outshine all light, yet are hidden deeper than any secret in our hearts. You who surpass all honor, though not in the eyes of men who see all honor in themselves. At last my mind was free from the gnawing anxieties of ambition and gain, from wallowing in filth and scratching the itching sore of lust. I began to talk to you freely, O Lord my God, my light, my wealth, and my salvation. I think it's a powerful testimony, as powerful as anything that he ever wrote in his anti-Pelagian writings, that grace comes from God from beginning to end. That's what the confession is. Augustine looks back on his life and he realizes that everything that happened to him was by God to get him to the point that he was at. So, that's Augustine on grace. Are there any more questions?